Welcome to Fabric Monday. Today I'll talk about the Fabric database, one of the biggest features announced during the last Ignite. What is this exactly? Let's discover. So, what is it? What's Fabric database? Instead of having to go to Azure to provision a relational database, we have our own relational database inside Fabric, and they are built over Azure SQL Database technology. They are basically an Azure SQL database inside Fabric, provided by Azure SQL, as I said, built over Azure SQL technology, and easy to configure relational database for production work. This is intended for productional, relational work, not exactly analytical work. For analytical work, we have the data warehouse inside Microsoft Fabric. But in this case, we have an Azure SQL database, a relational database for production inside Fabric environment. These are the internals of this new feature. Let's take a look of how this works. We are seeing the internals, not exactly what we see during the while. During the while, we see the provisioning of a database inside Fabric. But what is actually happening is that the database is being provisioned inside Azure environment. Azure is taking care of the provisioning. Azure is taking care of the high availability, reliability, everything. But you see and manage your database inside Fabric. But the database is in Azure or in Fabric? The database is in Azure. Fabric for storage uses OneLake, which stores Delta and Packet files. What happens is that the database in Fabric makes a close to real-time mirroring to the Delta and Packet files in OneLake. In this way, in this close to real-time mirroring in Fabric, you can use this data by using shortcuts in Lakehouse, consuming this data in Power BI, and so on. And you'll be consuming the mirrored data in OneLake, and you'll not even notice that this is happening. Let's see a demonstration provisioning a Fabric database. I have here a workspace called Fabric DB demo, and I'll start provisioning a Fabric database. I'll type here database, and here I have the SQL database in preview. Yes, they are still in preview. Let's give a name to this database, my Fabric DB, and create. After the creation, Fabric immediately opens the environment for us to use this database, and it's basically a SQL database. Tables, views, storage procedures, functions, and we can use the Azure SQL resources inside this Fabric database. And here is my Fabric database in the workspace. So I can see the Fabric database object appearing as SQL database. I can see a SQL analytical endpoint. Yes, it's provisioned to gather the SQL database and the semantic model. So it's a provisioning model similar to a Lakehouse or a data warehouse, for example, but for a relational database. Let's get back to our slides. All these I explained in this internals slide happened. The database was provisioned in Azure, and a near real-time mirroring was established between the database and the OneLake, although we don't have data yet in this database. All this happened, but we don't see. It's easy for the user don't see the complexity behind the scenes. Why are these internals so important? These internals are important because we understand they are backed up by a solid architecture. The feature is backed up by a solid architecture in Azure SQL. Production data is available for analytics. So we have the production data in Azure SQL, And this data is immediately available for analytics, and analytics doesn't affect production. One of the bad practices when using Power BI is to try to connect Power BI directly to production environment. This puts out the Power BI resource consumption over the production environment and creates a problem to production. Using a Fabric database like this creates an automatic mirroring, so the consumption in Power BI is made from the mirror, the OneLake, not from the production. The production doesn't feel any problem in relation to the Power BI consumption. How do we use this Fabric database? How should we use them? Well, there are many user scenarios, but this is a very powerful feature, and a feature powerful like this has the potential to create bad scenarios, bad users. So let's highlight some good, interesting scenarios for this. Small production applications. You are building a small application using Power Apps, you want a small database, something simple, you can use Fabric database for that. Why I'm highlighting this small? Can this be a big application? Well, the point is, in a big application, probably I want to manage it a bit better. I want to have the control. I want to manage the reliability. I want to manage the scalability. In big applications, it would be better to have it in Azure SQL, actually in Azure SQL or some flavors of Azure SQL. For a small application, Fabric database is great. And analytics supporting applications. There are many scenarios for supporting analytical applications. For example, imagine a sales analytics application measuring KPIs, and we need to establish the sales target for each month and adjust the sales target for each month, comparing the analytical information of how many sales were completed and with the target intended for that month. The analytical information about how many sales were completed is something that comes from analytical data, historical data from production. But the target for each month can be considered a piece of production to gather an analytical application. We need this data, and the users need to be capable to easily update this data. Fabric database is great for that. We can keep this data inside Fabric database and use together the facts of the production, the analytical application. Both can be used together to build great reports and make everything easy for the user. This even combined with another powerful feature which is announced but is not available yet, the write back in Power BI, the capability to write information back to database from Power BI reports. You could be making a write back to a Fabric SQL database. These are only some user scenarios for the usage of Fabric SQL database. But this Fabric database, they are in Azure and they are mirrored to Fabric. But we can by ourselves create an Azure SQL database in Azure and mirror them to Fabric. I already made videos about this. Yes, we have a Fabric Monday video about mirroring to Fabric. What's the difference? The difference is that with Fabric database, you don't need to manage anything related to Azure. You don't need to manage the SQLs of the database, scalability, anything. Fabric will manage everything for you. If you don't want to, if you want to have this tool to manage everything, you can still provision the database in Azure SQL and make the mirroring in Fabric. It's a choice about if you will delegate the management to Fabric or you make the manage yourself by provisioning and mirroring. The end result is very similar in both situations. The difference is the work and how much you can customize each scenario. Let's see a Additional demonstrations about the Fabric database. Here we are back to our Fabric database. Let's see how we can use this Fabric database as a regular SQL database. If you come to Settings, this button, Settings, I can see the connection strings, and I can see the connection string for my Fabric database. What's important here is to extract the server name, so I can be able to connect to the Fabric SQL database. I can use SSMS. Yes, I can use SSMS to make the connection. Database engine is a simple connection to a SQL database, so I use database engine. However, I'm connecting to a specific database name. I'm not connecting server level. Server level connections are not allowed. So I need to get the name of the database, which is a generated name, not exactly the name of the object. So I need to get the name of the database and use the name of the database in SSMS. Here it is. I need to fill the proper connect to database to make the connection. Once I do this, I'll be capable to connect. My authentication was already in cache, otherwise it would have asked for my Azure authentication, and I can already see the database and the object, which is in fact empty, completely empty. I can create new objects, I can create new tables, and so on. For example, new table, I can create it. But let's consider that I already have some applications implemented in Azure, in an Azure SQL, and I want to bring them to a Fabric database. What should I do? What should I do to bring existing applications to a Fabric database? You may have heard about database projects. The concept of projects to make source control in SQL databases. They are also called by the extension name, file extension name, DACPAC. There is a variety of this kind of database project, which is called BACPAC instead of DACPAC. This variety, this BACPAC, is a kind of database project which contains it resembles a backup of the database. It's like if you copied everything, but not exactly in the format of backup or with the consequence of a restore. So what we should do in relation to this information? So here I'm in Azure, I have a database that eventually works little, and I need to export this database, use the export option, and this export option will generate a BACPAC file which I can use to retrieve the database in another place, import the database in another environment, like the Fabric SQL database. The export is made to a storage. I will not complete the entire process. I already did the export. The export takes some time. So you need to choose a storage and then complete the export process. Once you complete the export process, you can go to the server level and check the import-export history. Import-export history to follow the progress of this export. Here you see I have an export database already completed for this database. I already did this export. This export takes time. That's why you need to go to the server level and follow it happening. See when it's completed, and only after that you can go to the storage and actually retrieve the export file. The exported file, which is a BACPAC. So you retrieve a BACPAC. You download this BACPAC to your machine and start to import it inside Microsoft Fabric. How you do this last step? How to import this BACPAC inside Microsoft Fabric? Here we go to Visual Studio Code. Yes, we will need to use Visual Studio Code to import that backpack file inside our Microsoft database. I'm already positioned in the folder where I saved the backpack. The backpack is saved inside this folder. The first step I need to execute is that I need to ensure the tool called SQL package is installed in my machine. If this tool is not installed in my machine, I can install it. I can use this statement to install the SQL package in my machine. This is the first step. After I install the SQL package in my machine, I can make the import using the SQL package. I need to adjust the statement for the import. The SQL package statement for the import requires the entire connection string, not only the server name and the database name, the entire connection string. Once I got it, I can build my statement to be executed in Visual Studio Code. Let's go there and I will pass my statement. Let's analyze how this statement is built. SQL package, action, import, source file, AdventureWorks Little Backpack. This works for two reasons. First, I already downloaded the backpack. And second, I'm making the call from the folder where the backpack is located. Otherwise, I would need to provide a full path for the file. And target connection string. The target connection string is the full connection string I just retrieved from the settings of my Fabric database. And once the statement is built, I can execute it. And the import process starts. It requires an authentication. I need to authenticate in the browser for the import to be completed. So I'll make my authentication. And after the authentication, it returns to the Visual Studio Code and initialize the deploy. The import is completed. It was executed by Visual Studio Code, by the SQL package triggered by Visual Studio Code. There were some incompatibilities, which is advised here. They are not important for our example. And now I'll be able to see my tables inside the database. Let's take a look. Let's make a refresh. In the DBO schema, I have only the big product, which is exactly the table that had some incompatibility issues. But I also have the sales LT schema with all the tables from the AdventureWorks database. They were retrieved from the backpack. I also can see these tables when accessing through my SSMS. Here they are, the tables from the AdventureWorks database from my Azure environment retrieved inside the Fabric database. And in this way, I can migrate an application, an existing application from Azure to Microsoft Fabric using Fabric database for this purpose. This is only the first video I make about Fabric database. This is a long subject. We'll have many more Fabric Monday videos dedicated to it along the time. Thank you very much for watching and see you next week.